Tomorrow, Tuesday, May 25th, 2021, marks 1 year since the murder of George Floyd. Students, colleagues, and even you personally may be feeling the effects of George Floyd's death and many other current events. This week's episode of the Monday Minute reflects on these effects through the lens of trauma-informed pedagogy. Trauma is a response to overwhelmingly stressful events that exceed and undermine our ability to cope and which negatively affect our functioning afterwards, often persistently. Trauma includes not just things like physical abuse, but also experiences that U.S. society tends to ignore, such as systemic racism. Trauma is common. Reports suggest that roughly 70% of U.S. adults and slightly more U.S. college students experience trauma. Our first step in developing trauma-informed teaching practices is to assume that most students and colleagues have trauma histories, and then building around that assumption. So we know what trauma-informed pedagogy is. How do we implement it? Let's start with a thought experiment. Take out a piece of paper if you have one. I'll read a prompt and put it on the screen. When you have the prompt, pause the video and reflect for as long as you need. Think of a few ways the traumatic events of the past year might be affecting your and your students' capacities to learn. What's one thing you could do differently if you knew that some or all of your students had lived through trauma? Welcome back. If you're willing, I'd love if you'd share ideas you came up with on our open space document. You can post with your name or anonymously. If you're accessing this episode of the Monday Minute, you most likely teach at CUNY, where, as Miranda Fedock reminds us in her blog post for Visible Pedagogy, the majority of undergraduates are students of color, immigrants, and/or students with other marginalized identities. These students are always already likely to experience trauma, institutional racism, sexism, colorism, classism, colonial practices, anti-immigrant practices, and so many other factors have an effect. As Miranda states, our students learn in an institution and in classrooms fundamentally shaped by these traumatizing realities. Systemic changes are needed in higher education and in our society at large to put an end to such chronic trauma, and we must work towards making those changes happen. In addition, we can help create spaces of care and healing at CUNY by recognizing trauma and by doing what we can to prevent further harm. Miranda offers a great list of ideas for creating learning environments that promote emotional safety and resilience. I'll share a link to her blog on our open space document, and I encourage you to share any resources you've found helpful in developing your own trauma-informed pedagogy. Trauma-informed pedagogy acknowledges trauma as a lived experience, but it does not mean that instructors should play therapist, ask about or discuss people's trauma histories, or remove challenging material from the curriculum. Trauma-informed pedagogy is about self and communal care and prioritizing safety and healing in educational spaces. It can be as simple as making short, mindful breathing exercises a priority in your teaching routine. Thank you for accessing this episode of the Monday Minute, and be kind to yourself and your students this week and every week. Be well.